Hello, music makers. Welcome back. Whether you're an aspiring new producer or even a well-traveled DJ, you might be shocked to find out that these impressive line array systems you see at most festivals, or those fancy Void or Function 1 systems at your favorite club, believe it or not, a majority of the time, those are running in mono. That's right, you heard me, mono. And not just those. Anyone listening on phone speakers, TVs, soundbars, laptops, even if the playback is stereo, they would have to have their nose squished up to the screen to get the speakers anywhere close to a stereo angle. So, all that time you spent panning and getting that lead to sound extra fat and wide, not only might it be pointless, it might be worse than pointless, because you might actually be damaging your track for playback in the place that matters most, the dance floor. Let's have a chat, shall we? This comment from Big Man Mike reminded me of the situation most of you might be in, as was I many years ago. At some point into your music making journey, someone has reminded you to check your mix in mono, like I just did. So you bring up that last track you were proud of, and this happens. Oh dear, oh dear. The track sounds nothing like it does in stereo. It completely collapses. What do we do? So first of all, we need to understand what's going on before we can understand how to fix it. It's easy to get confused because technically mono just means one channel of playback. Instead of two different channels, left and right, we just have one. And that can lead to people presuming that mono just means the left or the right channel, just one of them. But in reality, the mono playback we refer to in most scenarios is a little more complicated than that. What we actually mean by mono is the sum of both channels added together. Now, that doesn't sound too bad, does it? Surely, if we're using both channels, the left and the right, then the whole track should be there, right? Well, as you heard, unfortunately not. What happens when you sum the left and the right is any differences between the left and the right get deleted. Only the things that both channels have in common is what remains. So in other words, everything that makes a sound wide gets cancelled. You'll notice on certain plugins, like this one by Tokyo Dawn here, you can set it to a mode that only works on the sum or the difference. But a more common term is probably mid and side. I'm sure many of you by now have heard the term mid-side processing, meaning that processor can work separately on the mid signal, the mono sum, versus the side signal, the difference. So when you check in mono, press that mono button, you are getting both channels summed. And that is the same way many live systems are run, like I said in the intro. But why do they do that? It's simply because you only really get the benefits of stereo sound when the speakers are either side of your head. So if you're not stood exactly in the middle of the club facing forwards, you're going to suffer from some of those cancellations that happen when you sum two signals together. And that's the simplified version. Live sound designers have to deal with time delays, room shapes, all kinds of other factors. So as you might imagine, it's much easier to run the signal in mono. Okay, science lesson over. Let me show you some common issues that come up, how to look out for them, and what to listen for. So, what's the first thing we notice when we listen to this comparison? Our first red flag is massive level change. That's not a good sign, but it's not just the overall volume, it's the internal balance of each part. The vocals versus the synths, the bass versus the kick, etc. Whatever your intentions are for the balance of your track, still have to be there in mono. Can we still hear the lyrics? Is the lead hook still a lead hook? Have another listen. This time pay attention to balance changes. very different. And a different groove too. Notice the clap has died. And we've lost the lead. So remember, this isn't just an engineer's argument for sound quality. This will actually affect the way this track is danced to and experienced in the club. Now, beyond just level changes, I want you to be listening for sound changes too. Some sounds might become duller, as their high frequencies are the ones that are cancelling. Or the opposite, your bass might have less bass. Nightmare! Or beyond just dull and bright, the actual character might change. A drum might lose its attack. Let's check this bass pad first. Much lower overall, but less bass relatively too. And with this being dance music, losing bass is bad news. Speaking of essential sounds, some parts in your track are going to be more essential than others. Those are the ones you want to stay strong in mono. It's fine to let non-essential elements fall away a bit in mono. Some things can just be a stereo luxury for headphone users or those with great systems. So we're listening out for significant volume changes or tonal changes. But what about when selecting your sounds? There are certain sounds and traits you can be keeping an ear out for without even checking in mono. If a synth patch or sample or whatever sound you're auditioning has a larger-than-life 3D, almost surround sound quality to it, then that's an instant red flag. Because you can't break the laws of physics. There's no such thing as extremely wide and strong in mono. Now, the good news is, until you get an ear for it, this is one of the areas of sound you can rely on metering for. What you're looking for is a correlation meter. You see one built into span in the bottom right here. Let's check the bass again. The general idea is if it falls below 0 on this meter, then it won't be very strong in mono. But the whole thing is a scale, -1 to +1, +1 being completely mono. So this is fully mono. This is only half correlated. Correlation just means what's in common between the two channels, left and right. So you might say only half of this sound is in common between the left and right. So it will certainly change, but it might be okay. -1 is what we need to avoid. The problem with simple meters like this is they are showing the average for all frequencies. Watch what happens on the drop here. Because the kick is in mono and the sub-frequencies are also intact, and because low frequencies count for infinitely more energy than high frequencies, this meter is going to show our drop is safely above 0. So it looks fine on this meter, but as we heard earlier, it's definitely not. What we need is a 3D meter showing correlation against frequency. Another great free tool by Voxengo, Correlameter. Now, what does this tell us about our drop? That's a much better picture of what is going on. The further a frequency falls downwards on this meter, the more it will disappear in mono. So as you can see, bass frequencies, all good. Everything else, not so much. Now let's check that break section. Oh dear, that's going to absolutely die in the club. By the way, quick disclaimer, this whole project I've put together here is an extreme example, but it's not entirely unrealistic. Many samples and synth patches are overly widened in order to impress us and catch our attention. So when you're not used to catching this kind of stuff, it can easily happen to you. So what sounds exactly are common culprits for this? Well, the bad news is anything really apart from kick drums, usually. For example, any sound that comes out of a synth, if it is stereo, it will usually achieve that in one of two ways, either something called unison or an effect like chorus. Unison is just multiplying all the oscillators and panning them across the spectrum, but usually each one of those is randomized in terms of its phase. And differences in phase are exactly what is contained in the side channel, the difference channel. In other words, the bits that get deleted in mono. Chorus is a different thing, but just as problematic. So keep an ear out for that with synthesizers. Listen to this pad sound, for example. Beautiful wide soundscape, but when we check this in mono, we've lost some of the flavor, and of course we've lost a lot of level too. Now, it's not just synthesized sounds, acoustic sounds, like pianos, strings. On average, these are more problematic than synths. Sounds beautiful, but in mono, I won't go into the science of it here, but miking up real instruments in stereo is hard. Check out these strings. Orchestral string sections are typically recorded very wide. Yes, we've lost a lot of warmth and atmosphere. Speaking of atmosphere, reverbs. Again, to impress you with a sense of space, the output of a lot of reverbs can be extremely wide. Check if your favorite reverb has a width control, and try to get out of the habit of running it at 100%. That is, of course, if the reverb atmosphere is a crucial element to the track. Now, this problem isn't as common, but I have encountered my fair share of overly wide claps in my time. You might find something like this happens. If you listen to this in mono, it sounds like it's got a flanger effect on. You may also find this on drum top loops in general. That effect you're hearing there is known as comb filtering. So called because looking at the frequency response, all the dips caused by phase cancellation make the pattern of a comb. This is usually the sign that the sound was artificially widened via a non-mono-safe widening technique, of which there are many. The main one that comes to mind is Dimension Expander. Ever since Native Instruments released Massive, that synth had a built-in effect called Dimension Expander, which many like to emulate, but it is not mono-safe. That includes Serum. Yes, that synth also copied it. I think it's the yellow module inside the effects section. I recommend you turn that off. It will never be essential to the character of the sound, and you can do it in a much safer way later. Speaking of which, let me show you that next. Okay, solutions. What can we do about it? In the case of this clap, the one that sounded very flangy in mono, obviously my first suggestion would be go get another clap. But if you must use this clap, then in the case of these sounds which go very phasey or flangy in mono, one thing you can try is to check either the left or the right channel in isolation. One of those might be healthier than the combined signal. I can use isolate here, making sure the monitor center mode is on. That lets me audition the left, right, mid, or side individually whilst keeping the sound in the center. Let's check the left. Let's check the right. As we can hear, the left sounds much better than the middle. So this isolate is on my master channel right now. Let me put a copy on the clap track itself. Remember to change that mode to monitor central, otherwise you will just get the left from the left side. Or there's a high chance your DAW has a built-in utility type plugin which will let you do the same thing. I'm only using isolate here because it's free, but if your software has one built in, use that for this simple task. It probably takes up less CPU. So now we have a mono clap, but if we do want it to have some width, for the sake of artistic taste, now we can use a mono-safe width enhancer like Infected Mushroom's Wider, or my favorite, Voxengo Stereo Touch. All we have to do is keep it under 30 milliseconds, quite low, do a little bit of filtering of the lows and highs, and there we go. Now, we know the mono won't be damaged. We just have to balance the mono versus stereo level. To me, this strikes a good balance. We have a tasteful amount of width, but no massive level or quality change in mono. Let's hear that in context. Okay, so the drum backbeat feel is back now. Our clap no longer dies and flanges in mono. Okay, let's look at a synth next. Let's look at the bass. So here I'm just using one of Ableton's built-in synths. I don't have a lot of control over the width side of things. If I was using Vital or Serum, those synths do have a master width control, probably set somewhere between 50% and 70%. If you've balanced your entire track in stereo though, that will drop the total level. So remember, you'll need to readjust the volume to compensate. As you might imagine, this is why it's good to balance the track in mono first. Now, if your synth of choice doesn't have a width control, we can use a simple plugin like Voxengo's MSED, another free one. First, let me balance this bass in mono. Needs to be higher. Sounds like we need some of this too. See how the perception of balance suddenly changes in mono? Now what we do is check in stereo and adjust the balance of the side channel. So that's a similar perceived level, but if we look at the meters, those who can't afford to run stereo subwoofers, that includes me, might not have spotted this. The corellometer is showing our sub-frequencies are in trouble. Now, normally I would just recommend you use a separate sine wave track, which I have done on the drop, but as this is just the break pad bass, let me show you the quick fix. Alex Hilton, A1 stereo, turn on safe bass. Good, good. Now, as an added bonus, if we happen to ever get mastered to vinyl, the needle won't skip off the groove. Okay, so the next main problem was our lead sound. That was dying. Now, if you listen to this in solo, that doesn't sound like a big enough difference to worry about. But this is why we listen in context, because in context, our main lead hook here is sinking too far down. It's still audible, but it's just not front and center like it's supposed to be. There's no major problem frequencies, so I can just grab Voxengo's MSED, and I'm just going to increase the mid channel a little and dip the side channel a little. Or we might not need to decrease the width here, only increase the mono. There we go, I'm happy with that. That's a good balance between mono and stereo. Now, if you have a sound which is more problematic in certain frequency areas than others, we can use another very handy free plugin called ARX1 by VST Zone. This lets us pick 4 frequency bands and adjust the width of them independently. So if we look at the corellometer, it looks like we're fluctuating wildly below about 120. So I'll set this about here. Then we seem to have another group fluctuating up to around, let's call it 500. We don't have to be mega precise here. So now we can use these 4 buttons to listen to the different bands. And there's a phase meter at the bottom of the plugin we can keep an eye on if we don't have our corellometer open. So the subs are dipping very low. We'll have to be quite strict with those. Certainly nothing more than 50% width. Again, let me remind you, this decision is only if you deem this sound crucial in mono. I might yet decide these strings are fine to disappear in mono. We'll see. Let's check the remaining 2 bands. This all needs to be done in context later, don't forget. That's not misbehaving too badly. We can leave that at about 80% maybe. And this band seems mostly fine. Then we click the middle button to listen to all bands. Now, just like we did with the bass pad, I'll have to adjust the total level. Now we've balanced it in mono. So now you know, if you have a string part that's collapsing in mono, and you deem it essential to the track, you could try this. Now, in terms of this track here, it turns out all of my pad sounds are problematic in mono. So time to make some decisions. But I've shown you all 3 methods I use to get tracks in good mono shape. So I'm going to go through the rest of the sounds now, either adjusting with just mid-side or multiband mid-side with ARX1, or isolating the left or right. I'll see you in a second through the power of editing.
2 hours later.
Okay, I'm back. Here's how our break is sounding. In mono. And the drop. Okie dokie. Still sounds like great vibes. Good atmosphere, not as wide as it was, obviously, but plenty wide enough, and it will sound a million times better in the club now. Job done. Here are some bonus tips I didn't manage to mention earlier. If you're using a synth and it has unison voices enabled, try to select an odd number of unison voices. Many synths go up to 16, so try that on 15. The logic being that, presuming the synth pans each voice equally across the stereo spectrum, if there's an odd number, it will have to leave one in the middle. For example, if 3 voices are used, it will pan one left, one right, leave one central. Whereas if it tries to pan 4 voices equally, you can't have one in the middle. Therefore, the patch is potentially less mono-compatible. So try that on your synths. Speaking of panning, I would advise to be very careful. You'll see in 99.9% of my tracks, I don't pan anything. First of all, do not use panning to solve mix problems. All you are doing there is literally sweeping the problem to one side. The problem will still exist, and when it gets played in a club in mono, whatever you were trying to avoid will clash with it again. You either have an arrangement problem, a sound selection problem, or a mix problem. Sort it out in mono first. Panning does nothing to solve any of these. If you are panning for artistic taste reasons, then I would advise you make sure it is not a part which is crucial to the groove. Because in the case where the club does play in stereo, you don't want the people stood by the right-hand speaker to be the only group getting the full groove. And the last thing to be aware of when panning is it will change the volume in mono. Panning all the way to one side or the other does not cancel the sound in mono, but it will change the volume. Depending on your DAW's pan law, it's called a pan law, it could be up to 6 decibels, which is twice the volume. So a fully panned part may be half as loud in mono. Bass. Bass is always a problem in stereo. Longer frequencies have longer wavelengths, and if those frequencies cancel or clash, It's not just going to sound like it has a flanger on top of it, it can sound like random bass cuts for very long periods of time. Not good in a genre that relies on solid bass. If you've seen my bass processing video, that can help you. Separating your bass into a separate sine wave sub and upper bass part is not just good for side chain control and mastering headroom, it will also mean you can keep your subs in mono, and any width trickery only applying to the upper bass frequencies. Lastly, beware of judging width on headphones, as headphones are not stereo, they are binaural. If that statement confuses or shocks you, see this video by Dan Worrell for more on that. So, to sum up, it's the same as my general philosophy. If you pick the right sounds to begin with, including spotting sounds which are too wide, then you shouldn't have to do much processing at all to get everything to work. In terms of stereo, the way I tend to work is to start mono and expand outwards. Whereas coming at it from the other direction, starting too wide and then having to rein it in, is going to be a lot more work. And in some cases, some sounds just aren't savable. And I think that's everything I can think of. If you found the video helpful, share the video for me, or press one of those buttons you find appropriate. All the relevant links will be in the description, and until next week, I'll see you in the comments. Bye-bye.